The evacuation order came at 11:47 p.m., typed in standard emergency protocol format, delivered through the automated notification system to every terminal in the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. Clear the coastal zones. Mandatory evacuation within 6 hours. All personnel to execute standard withdrawal procedures immediately. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra. Special for you. Dr. Sarah Chun sat alone in the seismology lab, her fingers hovering over a keyboard that could send an alert to 47 million people across the Pacific Basin. The official recommendation glowed on her screen in government-issued Helvetica font. Current threat assessment does not warrant full-scale population alert. Maintain standard evacuation protocols for immediate coastal areas only. She had signed the preliminary report 3 hours earlier. Her name was already attached to the decision. The paperwork was filed. The chain of command had been followed. Precisely. But the readings on her secondary monitoring station told a different story. Outside, the Honolulu Emergency Management Headquarters buzzed with controlled activity. Phones rang in measured intervals. Coffee was being brewed for the night shift. Down the hallway, Regional Director Marcus Williams was explaining to the governor's office why a full-scale alert wasn't necessary. His voice carried the confident tone of someone who had followed protocol for 23 years without a single false alarm on his record. Sarah's screen displayed 2 sets of data. The official reading showed a 6.8 magnitude undersea earthquake, significant but manageable. The kind that generated standard coastal advisories and orderly evacuations of beachfront properties. The secondary array, her own network of deep ocean sensors that she had been calibrating for 8 months, showed something else entirely. The fault line hadn't stopped moving. She clicked through the sensor feeds methodically. Station Alpha 7. Position 200 miles northwest of the main epicenter. Registered a secondary rupture that had occurred 17 minutes after the initial event. Station Bravo 3 detected seafloor displacement continuing at depths that shouldn't have been possible. With the initial quake reading, Station Charlie 1 showed pressure waves propagating in a pattern that meant the ocean floor was still shifting, still dropping, still displacing massive volumes of water that were building into something far beyond the computer models that headquarters was using. Her unofficial sensors weren't part of the federal monitoring grid. They were her own research project, funded through a small university grant and installed during weekend diving expeditions over the past 2 years. The National Weather Service didn't recognize their data. The Emergency Management Agency didn't include them in official calculations. According to every protocol manual in the building, they didn't exist. According to her readings, a wave nearly 4 times larger than projected was building 400 miles offshore and moving toward a sleeping population that had been told they had 6 hours to evacuate the immediate beachfront. They had 47 minutes. Sarah pulled up the population density maps for the affected coastline. Honolulu alone held 400,000 people within the projected impact zone. Add Maui, the Big Island, and the scattered coastal communities across the chain, and the number approached 1 million. The standard evacuation protocol assumed people would have time to gather belongings, secure their homes, arrange transportation, and move to designated inland shelters in an orderly fashion. Her data suggested they would have time to run. She reached for the red phone that connected directly to the emergency alert system. Her hand stopped 6 inches from the receiver. Activating that system without authorization from the regional director was a federal offense. Bypassing the chain of command during an emergency could result in immediate termination, criminal charges, and permanent blacklisting from any government position. The protocol was clear. All alert authorizations must flow through Director Williams, who reported to the Federal Emergency Management Coordinator, who reported to the National Weather Service, who reported to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The process typically took 45 minutes to complete. She had 46 minutes until impact. The lab door opened behind her. Dr. James Rodriguez, her research partner and the only other person in the building who understood her sensor network, stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had been reviewing the same data. "You've seen it too," she said without turning around. "The secondary ruptures started 18 minutes ago." His voice was steady, but she could hear the concern underneath. "The displacement readings are off the charts. This isn't a 6.8 anymore." "What? Are you calculating for wave height? Conservatively? 70 feet. Realistically? Over 100. He set one coffee cup beside her keyboard and kept the other cradled in both hands. "Sarah, if these numbers are right, they are right. Then we need to tell Williams immediately." She turned to face him for the first time. "I tried, 20 minutes ago. He said the federal sensors are the only ones that matter and that my equipment hasn't been certified through proper channels. He said we stick to protocol." James looked at the time display on the wall. 11:51 p.m. What's the official timeline for full alert authorization? 43 minutes for emergency review, assuming no delays. And your wave projection? 45 minutes until first impact. She turned back to her screen and pulled up a simulation that showed the wave front moving across the Pacific like an expanding circle of destruction. Small red dots marked coastal cities along its path. James, the first place it hits is Hilo Bay. 15,000 people live in the evacuation zone. Most of them are asleep right now. The secondary monitoring station emitted a soft chime. New data from Station Delta 9, positioned closest to the epicenter. The reading showed the seafloor was still dropping. The wave was still building. Her original estimates had been conservative. "It's accelerating," she whispered. James leaned over her shoulder to read the numbers. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his hands. "Sarah, that's impossible. The models don't account for continuous fault displacement. The models are wrong." She pulled up a cross-section view of the ocean floor. "Look at this. The initial rupture was just the beginning. The entire shelf is collapsing in stages. Each collapse adds to the wave. It's not one tsunami anymore. It's a cascade." The red dots on her map suddenly seemed very small, very vulnerable, very unaware that their world was about to change in ways that no emergency protocol had ever anticipated. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister, who lived in a beachfront apartment in Kailua. "Saw the alert on TV. Packing up just in case. Thanks for the heads up, sis. See you tomorrow." Sarah stared at the message. Her sister thought she had 6 hours. She thought she could pack belongings, secure her apartment, maybe even stop by their parents' house to help them evacuate. She thought the word mandatory meant when convenient. She had 42 minutes. The lab's main computer terminal displayed the official threat assessment, unchanged since the initial alert. Current wave projections indicate maximum heights of 15 to 20 feet along populated coastlines. Standard evacuation procedures remain in effect. No additional alerts authorized at this time. Her secondary array painted a different picture entirely. Wave heights approaching 120 feet. Impact velocity nearly tripled the standard projections. Coastal penetration extends up to 2 miles inland. Areas that had never been included in evacuation zones suddenly falling within the projected destruction path, including the building she was sitting in. Sarah opened her desk drawer and removed a laminated card that contained the emergency contact. Numbers for every major news station, radio network, and emergency broadcast system in the state. The list wasn't supposed to exist. Creating unauthorized contact protocols was against department policy. But she had compiled it anyway, 8 months ago. after a minor earthquake had revealed how slowly information moved through official channels. She had hoped she would never need to use it. The red phone sat silent on the desk beside her. One call could activate an alert system that would reach every cell phone, every television, every radio in the affected area within 3 minutes. But that call required authorization from Director Williams, who was currently explaining to state officials why such an alert wasn't necessary. Her unofficial phone, her personal cell phone, could reach the news stations directly. No authorization required. No protocol to follow. No chain of command to respect. Also no legal protection if she was wrong. James watched her stare at both phones. "Sarah, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that in 38 minutes, people are going to die because we followed the rules." She picked up her cell phone and scrolled to the contact list she had never expected to use. "I'm thinking that sometimes being right matters more than being authorized. If you're wrong about this... If I'm wrong, I lose my job and spend the next 10 years explaining why I panicked and violated federal emergency protocols." She looked at the wave simulation still building on her screen. "If I'm right and I do nothing, I spend the rest of my life knowing I could have saved them." The seismology lab fell quiet except for the soft hum of equipment and the distant sound of normal nighttime activity in the hallway outside. People going about their jobs, following procedures, trusting that the system would protect them. Sarah's finger hovered over the call button. In 37 minutes, the wave would reach Hilo Bay. In 36 minutes, it would destroy everything within 2 miles of the coastline. In 35 minutes, people who had trusted the 6-hour evacuation timeline would be caught in their cars, their homes, their beds, believing they still had time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The protocol was clear. The chain of command was established. The consequences for disobedience were severe and permanent. The readings on her screen were also clear. She pressed the call. The newsroom at KGMB Channel 9 operated under the steady rhythm of the night shift. 3 producers monitored feeds from across the Pacific. 2 anchors reviewed scripts for the morning broadcast. And 1 assignment editor fielded calls from stringers covering late-breaking stories across the islands. The emergency alert tone had sounded twice in the past hour, both times for the standard coastal advisory that everyone expected during seismic events. Sarah's call reached assignment editor Patricia Walsh at 11:53 p.m. Channel 9 Newsroom, this is Patricia. This is Dr. Sarah Chun from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. I need to speak with someone about an immediate broadcast emergency. Patricia had fielded dozens of similar calls over her 15-year career. Concerned scientists, worried officials, and occasional cranks all convinced they had information that warranted breaking into regular programming. Her response was practiced and professional. "Dr. Chun, we've already received the official tsunami advisory from your agency. We're running updates every 15 minutes as part of our standard severe weather coverage. You don't understand. The official advisory is wrong. I have data showing a massive wave will hit the islands in 35 minutes. People need to evacuate immediately, not in 6 hours. Ma'am, I'm going to need to verify your credentials and have you speak with our science correspondent. Can you hold while I transfer you? There isn't time for verification. Patricia, I need you to put me on the air right now." The urgency in Sarah's voice made Patricia pause. In 15 years, she had learned to distinguish between genuine panic and manufactured drama. This sounded genuine. "Dr. Chun, even if I believed you, which I'm not saying I don't, we can't just put unverified claims on the air. We have protocols for emergency broadcasts. I need official confirmation from your supervisors. My supervisors are following federal guidelines that don't account for the data I'm seeing." "Patricia, There are children sleeping in houses that will be underwater in half an hour. Please. Patricia looked around the newsroom. The overnight anchor was reviewing sports scores. The weather team had gone home hours ago. The senior producer was in the bathroom. Every protocol she had ever learned said to hang up the phone and wait for. Official channels. What kind of data are you talking about? Sarah's voice became more focused, more technical. I have deep ocean sensors showing continuous seafloor displacement. The earthquake wasn't a single event. It's a cascade failure. Each section of the fault that collapses adds energy to the wave. My calculations show wave heights over 100 feet, moving at 400 miles per hour. Dr. Chun, that sounds... mean. Are you certain about those numbers? Patricia, I've been studying tsunami mechanics for 12 years. I've published papers on cascade displacement theory. I know how these waves behave, and I know what's coming. The question is whether you're going to help me warn people or whether you're going to follow protocol while they die. Patricia grabbed a pen and started taking notes. What exactly are you asking me to do? Break into programming. Put me on the air. Let me explain what people need to do right now, not in 6 hours. I can't authorize emergency broadcasts. That requires approval from the news director, who's at home, and coordination with the emergency alert system, which requires government authorization. Then don't call it an emergency broadcast. Call it breaking news. Call it a scientific update. Call it whatever you want, but get me on the air. The assignment editor's training warred with her instincts. Everything she had been taught said to verify information through official channels. But the scientist on the phone sounded like someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Dr. Chun, if I do this and you're wrong, my career is over. If you don't do this and I'm right, a lot more than careers are going to be over. Patricia made a decision that violated every newsroom protocol she had ever learned. Stay on the line. I'm going to patch you through to our anchor desk. We'll put you on live in 2 minutes. While Patricia worked to bypass standard verification procedures, Sarah's colleague James was attempting to follow them. He had walked down the hallway to Director Williams' office, knocked politely, and requested permission to present additional data for review. Williams sat behind a desk covered with official reports, federal guidelines, and communication logs from other monitoring stations across the Pacific. The walls were lined with certificates, commendations, and photographs from 23 years of successful emergency management. His record was spotless. His procedures were flawless. His reputation was built on never crying wolf. Dr. Rodriguez, I appreciate your dedication, but we've already issued the appropriate advisory based on certified data from our primary monitoring network. Dr. Chen's experimental sensors aren't part of our official capability. Director, I understand the certification process, but the readings we're getting suggest the initial assessment may have been incomplete. Williams leaned back in his chair. He had dealt with eager researchers before, young scientists who believed their latest theories should override decades of established protocol. The system existed for good reasons. False alarms caused panic, economic disruption, and loss of public trust. One unnecessary full-scale evacuation could undermine the credibility of the entire warning system. James, I know you and Dr. Chun have been working on some interesting research, but research and operational reality are two different things. The Federal Monitoring Network represents millions of dollars in certified equipment, tested algorithms, and validated procedures. I can't override that system based on unofficial data from experimental sensors. What if the unofficial data is correct? Then the official data will reflect that within the next 20 minutes and will upgrade our advisory accordingly. That's how the system works. James looked at the clock on the wall. 11:56 p.m. Director, what if 20 minutes is too long? Dr. Rodriguez, I've been managing emergencies since before you graduated college. I've seen panicked researchers, I've seen computer glitches, and I've seen false alarms that caused more damage than the actual emergencies. The system works because we trust the process, not individual interpretations. Can you at least look at our data? Williams gestured toward a stack of papers on his desk. I have data from 47 monitoring stations, computer models from 3 different agencies, and communication protocols with emergency management teams across 4 time zones. Adding one more unverified data set isn't going to change the mathematical reality. What if it's not unverified? What if it's just uncertified? The distinction seemed to catch Williams' attention. Explain the difference. Our sensors use the same technology as the federal network. Same pressure detection, same seismic measurement, same transmission protocols. The only difference is that we installed them ourselves and haven't gone through the 2-year federal certification process, which exists for good reasons, which exists to prevent false alarms, not to ignore accurate data. Williams stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the coastline. The lights of Honolulu stretched toward the ocean, peaceful and unaware. James, do you understand what happens if I authorize a full-scale emergency alert and we're wrong? People get inconvenienced. People panic, traffic systems collapse. Hospitals evacuate critical patients unnecessarily. The economy loses millions of dollars. And the next time we issue a real warning, people don't trust us. He turned back toward the desk. False alarms kill credibility. Lost credibility kills people. And what if we're right? Williams returned to his chair and pulled up the official computer models on his screen. According to every certified system we have, current wave projections show manageable impact levels with adequate evacuation. Time using standard protocols. I'm not going to override that based on experimental equipment. James realized that no amount of scientific argument was going to change the director's mind. The system was designed to prevent exactly what he was asking for: rapid response based on unverified information. The fact that the information happened to be accurate was irrelevant to the protocol. Director, what would it take to authorize an immediate upgrade to the alert level? Confirmation from at least 2 other federal monitoring stations showing similar readings. Approval from the regional emergency coordinator. And verification that the threat exceeds current projections by at least 50%. How long does that process typically take? 45 minutes to an hour, depending on communication delays. James looked at the clock again. 11:58 p.m. According to Sarah's calculations, they didn't have 45 minutes. They barely had 30. Meanwhile, Sarah was discovering that breaking news protocols were almost as complex as emergency management procedures. Patricia had managed to patch her through to the anchor desk, but the overnight anchor, Kevin Tanaka, was hesitant to put an unverified scientist on live television without approval from his supervisors. Dr. Chun, I understand your concern, but we have standards for breaking news. I need confirmation from at least one other source before I can present this information as factual. Kevin, there isn't time for multiple sources. I am the source. I'm a federal employee with 12 years of tsunami research experience, and I'm telling you that people are going to die if they don't evacuate immediately. But you're not representing your agency in an official capacity, correct? No, I'm representing basic physics and mathematics. Kevin looked toward the assignment desk where Patricia was frantically trying to reach the news director by phone. Standard protocol said to wait for authorization. Human instinct said the scientist sounded genuinely terrified. Dr. Chun, if I put you on the air and you tell people to evacuate immediately, they're going to panic. Cars will crash. People will get hurt if you're wrong about the timeline. Kevin, if I'm wrong about the timeline, some people might get hurt. If I'm right and we do nothing, hundreds of people will die. Which risk are you comfortable taking? The anchor stared at his teleprompter, which displayed the standard script for the next news update. Weather advisory, sports scores. Traffic. Report. Nothing about cascading fault failures or unauthorized tsunami warnings. What exactly do you want me to tell people? Tell them that new data suggests the tsunami threat is more immediate than originally projected. Tell them to evacuate coastal areas immediately, not in 6 hours. Tell them to move to high ground right now. And if my news director fires me tomorrow for broadcasting unverified emergency information, then at least you'll be fired by someone. Who's still alive to fire you? Kevin made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Patricia, kill the commercial break. We're going live with breaking news in 30 seconds. At 11:59 p.m., while Director Williams was explaining federal monitoring protocols to James Rodriguez, while official emergency management teams were following established procedures, while government computers were processing data through certified algorithms, Kevin Tanaka looked into a television camera and said words that weren't in any script. We're interrupting our regular programming with breaking news. We have Dr. Sarah Chun from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center on the phone with urgent information about tonight's tsunami advisory. Sarah's voice came through clearly, professionally, and without hesitation. Kevin, thank you for taking my call. I need people to understand that new seismic data shows tonight's tsunami is going to be much larger and much faster than originally projected. People in coastal areas don't have 6 hours to evacuate. They have approximately 30 minutes. Dr. Chun, that's significantly different from the official advisory we received earlier. The official advisory was based on initial earthquake data. We now have evidence of continuing fault displacement that's creating a much larger wave. I'm looking at readings that suggest wave heights over 100 feet moving toward populated areas at tremendous speed. What should people do right now? Move to high ground immediately. Don't pack belongings. Don't secure property. Don't wait for official confirmation. Get in your car and drive away from the ocean as fast as possible. If you live within 2 miles of the coastline, you need to leave right now. Kevin had never delivered news like this before. His training was for standard emergencies, not for contradicting official government advisories on live television. Dr. Chun, how certain are you about this information? I've spent my entire career studying these events. I know what the data means, and I know what's coming. People who trust the 6-hour timeline are going to be caught in a wave that will destroy everything within miles of the shore. We're going to stay on the air with continuous coverage. Dr. Chun, thank you for calling us. As the conversation ended, Sarah looked at her monitoring station. The wave was 28 minutes from Hilo Bay. Her phone was already ringing with calls from other news stations who had heard the broadcast. James had returned from his unsuccessful meeting with Director Williams. The red phone that connected to the federal emergency system remained silent. But across the islands, people were beginning to move. The first phone call to Sarah's direct line came at 12:02 a.m. Dr. Margaret Foster from the University of Hawaii's Pacific Disaster Research Center had seen the television broadcast and wanted to verify the claims being made on live television. Sarah, I just saw you on Channel 9. Are you seriously suggesting that NOAA's wave projections are off by a factor of 5? Sarah didn't pause her work as she answered. Her fingers continued entering new sensor readings into a spreadsheet that had grown to 847 rows of data over the past hour. Margaret, I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating that the Federal Monitoring Network missed a cascade failure because their sensors aren't positioned to detect sequential seafloor displacement. That's a pretty significant accusation. It's not an accusation. It's mathematics. Sarah clicked to a new screen that displayed a 3-dimensional model of the ocean floor. Look, the initial earthquake was just the trigger. The fault isn't failing in one section. It's collapsing in stages, like dominoes. Each collapse adds energy to the wave system. Sarah, cascade theory is still largely theoretical. You published one paper on it 2 years ago, which is one more paper than anyone else has published on it. Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of frustration underneath. Margaret, I didn't develop this theory in a vacuum. I've been testing it with real sensor data for 8 months. Sensor data that isn't certified by any federal agency. Sensor data that's identical to federal equipment, except for the paperwork. Sarah pulled up a technical specification sheet on her secondary monitor. Same piezoelectric pressure transducers, same digital signal processing, same satellite communication protocols. The only difference is that I installed them myself instead of waiting 3 years for a government contractor to do it. Margaret's voice softened slightly. She had known Sarah since graduate school and respected her methodology, even when she disagreed with her conclusions. Walk me through your calculations. For the next 6 minutes, Sarah explained her cascade displacement model using technical language that most people wouldn't understand. She described fault mechanics, energy transfer equations, and wave propagation mathematics with the fluency of someone who had spent years thinking about nothing else. Her explanations were precise, detailed, and supported by data that she had collected methodically over months of careful research. The federal models assume a single rupture event, she concluded. They calculate wave energy based on the initial displacement and then project linear propagation across the Pacific. But if the fault continues to fail in sections, each failure adds exponentially to the total energy. Instead of one wave, you get a compound wave that's geometrically larger than any single event projection. Sarah, that's an elegant theory, but do you have evidence that sequential failure is actually happening? I have 17 sensors showing continued displacement at depths and locations that shouldn't be affected by the initial earthquake. I have pressure readings that indicate ongoing seafloor movement. I have wave measurements that show energy levels increasing rather than dissipating as the wave moves away from the epicenter. Can you send me the data? I can, but it'll take time you don't have. Margaret, my models show the first impact in 26 minutes. Even if you verify everything I'm telling you, how long would it take to get official authorization for a revised alert? Margaret knew the answer. Academic review processes weren't designed for real-time emergencies, probably 2 hours minimum. Then you understand the problem. After Margaret hung up, Sarah returned to work that most people couldn't comprehend, much less appreciate. Her computer setup occupied 3 monitors and involved software that she had written herself to process data from her unauthorized sensor network. The Federal Emergency Center had sophisticated equipment and trained operators, but their systems were designed to handle standard scenarios, using established protocols. Sarah's setup was designed to handle scenarios that the protocols hadn't anticipated. Her primary screen displayed a real-time map of the Pacific Ocean with colored overlays showing wave propagation, energy levels, and impact predictions. The federal version of this map, visible on computers throughout the emergency center, showed a manageable tsunami moving at predictable speeds toward prepared coastlines. Sarah's version showed something approaching the power of a natural catastrophe. Her secondary screen contained spreadsheets with calculations that went far beyond standard tsunami modeling. Where federal algorithms use simplified equations based on historical precedents, Sarah's work incorporated theoretical models that accounted for variables most systems ignored. Seafloor composition, water temperature gradients, bathymetric anomalies, and tidal interactions all factored into her projections. Her third screen held communication logs from her sensor network, raw data streams that updated every 30 seconds with new measurements from the ocean floor. Most tsunami monitoring relied on surface buoys and coastal instruments that measured waves after they had already formed. Sarah's sensors were positioned at critical points along the fault line itself, providing real-time data about the geological processes that created the waves. The door to her lab opened without a knock. Director Williams entered, flanked by two other officials Sarah didn't recognize. Their expressions were serious, professional, and skeptical. "Dr. Chen, I understand you've been making unauthorized public statements about tonight's emergency." Sarah didn't look away from her screens. "I've been providing accurate information based on scientific data. Scientific data that hasn't been reviewed or verified through proper channels. Scientific data that's being generated faster than proper channels can process it." She gestured toward her monitors. "Director, would you like to see what my sensors are showing right now?" Williams stepped closer to the displays, followed by the two officials. Sarah had learned over the years that most administrators preferred simplified summaries to raw data, but she had also learned that sometimes raw data was the only thing that commanded respect. "This is Station Alpha 7, she said, pointing to a data stream on the right monitor. Installed 200 miles northwest of the epicenter at a depth of 12,000 feet. It shows continued seismic activity that began 18 minutes after the initial earthquake. Aftershocks are normal. These aren't aftershocks, they're sequential fault failures. Look at the pressure readings." She highlighted a series of spikes that formed a clear pattern. Each spike represents a section of the fault dropping. The drops are getting larger and more frequent. One of the officials leaned in. "Dr. Chun, I'm Deputy Director Carson from FEMA Region 9. Even if your readings are accurate, how do you know they're causing the wave effects you're projecting?" Sarah had anticipated this question. She had been preparing to answer it for 8 months. "Because I've been modeling this exact scenario since the magnitude 7.2 earthquake off Alaska last year. I published preliminary findings in the Journal of Geophysical Research. The peer review process took 6 months, but the mathematics were validated by 3 independent research teams." She pulled up a research paper on her screen and scrolled to a section marked with red highlights. "Cascade failure theory predicts that sequential fault collapse will generate compound waves with energy levels that exceed linear projections by factors of 4 to 8. Tonight's event is the first real-world test of that theory." Dr. Chun Williams interjected, "Theoretical research and operational emergency management are different disciplines. We can't evacuate half the Pacific based on untested academic models. You're not evacuating half the Pacific. You're warning people who are about to be hit by a wave that's larger than your computers think it is." Sarah's voice remained steady, but her frustration was becoming more apparent. "Director, in 23 minutes, we're going to know which one of us is right. The question is whether we're going to warn people before then or explain afterward why we didn't." Deputy Director Carson studied the data displays with the attention of someone who understood technical information even if he didn't specialize in it. "Dr. Chun, these readings suggest wave heights over 100 feet. That's larger than anything in the historical record for this region. Because nothing in the historical record involved a cascade failure of this magnitude. This is a new type of event." "How can you be certain?" Sarah turned to face him directly. "Because I've spent 2 years preparing for exactly this scenario. I've read every paper published on tsunami mechanics in the last decade. I've analyzed every major tsunami event in recorded history. I've modeled hundreds of theoretical fault failure patterns. I know what normal tsunamis look like, and I know what this one looks like. They're not the same thing." The room fell quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the periodic chime of new data arriving from the sensor network. Williams looked at his watch, then at the displays, then at Sarah. "Dr. Chen, if your projections are correct, why aren't any other monitoring stations reporting similar readings?" "Because other monitoring stations aren't positioned to detect cascade failure. They're designed to measure the results of fault displacement, not the process of fault displacement. By the time their sensors register the full wave energy, It's too late to calculate accurate impact predictions. She pulled up a map showing the locations of federal monitoring equipment compared to her own sensors. Look at the positioning. Government sensors are concentrated near coastal areas and along established shipping routes. They're optimized for standard tsunami detection and commercial navigation support. And yours? Mine are positioned at geological stress points along the fault line itself. They're optimized for detecting the kind of sequential failure that the standard models don't account for. Deputy Director Carson asked the question that Sarah had been expecting since the conversation began. Dr. Chun, how much did this unauthorized sensor network cost and who funded it? Total equipment cost was $47,000 over 2 years, funded through a University of Hawaii research grant and personal funds. Installation was done during weekend diving expeditions using volunteer graduate students. And this $47,000 system is contradicting a federal monitoring network that cost $200 million. This $47,000 system is positioned in places the $200 million. Network isn't. Cost doesn't determine accuracy. Position and methodology determine accuracy. Williams looked at Carson, then back at Sarah. Dr. Chun, even if we accepted your data as valid, we can't simply override established protocols based on one person's interpretation. Then don't override the protocols. Supplement them. Sarah turned back to her keyboard and began typing rapidly. I'm sending real-time sensor feeds to every major emergency management center in the Pacific Basin. I'm copying my wave projection models to university research centers in California, Oregon, and Alaska. I'm transmitting my fault analysis to the Japan Meteorological Agency and the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Ua Beach. Dr. Chun, you can't distribute unverified data to international agencies. I'm not distributing unverified data. I'm distributing data that hasn't been verified through bureaucratic processes. There's a difference. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, executing data transmission protocols that she had tested but never used in a real emergency. Within 90 seconds, her sensor readings were being received by monitoring stations across the Pacific Rim. Now, we wait, she said, turning back to face the officials. In about 12 minutes, those agencies are going to start calling with questions about the data they're receiving. In 21 minutes, we're going to know whether my projections were accurate. Director Williams realized that the situation had moved beyond his control. Whether Sarah was right or wrong, she had already taken actions that would have consequences far beyond his authority to manage. Dr. Chun, you understand that what you've just done may constitute a violation of federal emergency protocols. What I've just done may save lives that federal emergency protocols were going to let die. Deputy Director Carson's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He looked at the display and frowned. It's the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Ua Beach. Sarah glanced at the clock on her wall. That was faster than I expected. As Carson stepped aside to take the call, Sarah returned to her monitors and the work that only she fully understood. Her sensors continued collecting data that painted a picture of destruction, approaching coastlines where people were still deciding whether they had time to pack belongings before evacuating. In 18 minutes, the wave would reach Hilo Bay. Her mathematical models, her theoretical research, and her unauthorized sensor network would be tested against the reality of physics and human survival. She hoped she was wrong. She knew she WSN single quotes T. Deputy Director Carson's phone conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Sarah watched him through her peripheral vision while continuing to monitor her sensors, noting the way his posture shifted from skeptical to concerned to alarmed as the call progressed. That was Dr. Yamamoto from the Japan Meteorological Agency, Carson said as he ended the call. They're seeing the same cascade pattern in your data that you've been describing. They want to know why this information wasn't shared through official channels 6 hours ago. Sarah didn't look away from her screens. Because 6 hours ago, the cascade hadn't developed enough to register on standard monitoring equipment. Fault. Failures this complex evolve in real time. Director Williams stepped closer to Carson. What exactly did the Japanese tell you? They're upgrading their Pacific-wide tsunami alert to maximum threat level. Dr. Yamamoto said cascade failure events require completely different evacuation protocols because wave arrival times can be accelerated by up to 300%. Carson looked at his watch. He asked how much time we have left. 16 minutes until first impact at Hello Bay, Sarah said without hesitation. 19 minutes until the wave reaches Honolulu Harbor. 22 minutes until it hits populated coastal areas on Oahu. Williams reached for the red phone that connected directly to the Federal Emergency Alert System. His hand stopped halfway to the receiver as he realized the magnitude of the decision he was about to make. Activating a full-scale emergency alert would reach every cell phone, television, and radio in the Hawaiian Islands within 90 seconds. It would also trigger automatic evacuation protocols, emergency service deployments, and economic disruptions that would cost millions of dollars. If Sarah was wrong, his career would end in disgrace. If she was right and he hesitated, thousands of people would die. Dr. Chun, I need your best estimate of wave height at populated coastlines. Sarah pulled up her impact simulation and adjusted the parameters based on the latest sensor readings. Conservative estimate, 85 feet. Realistic estimate, 120 feet. Worst case scenario, 160 feet. Jesus Christ, Carson muttered. Williams, at those heights, we're looking at complete destruction up to 2 miles inland. Williams looked at the simulation on Sarah's screen, which showed a wall of water moving across the Pacific like a spreading stain. Red zones marked areas where wave heights exceeded 100 feet. Yellow zones indicated areas where the water would penetrate more than a mile inland. Green zones, representing areas that would be relatively safe, covered less than 30% of the populated coastline. How certain are you about these projections? Mathematically, I'm 94% confident in the core calculations. The wave mechanics are well-established physics. The only variable is the exact timing of additional fault failures, which could make the wave slightly larger or smaller than projected. Carson's phone rang again. This time it was the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Alaska. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned to Williams with an expression that had moved beyond concern into something approaching panic. Alaska is evacuating coastal areas from Kodiak to Sitka. They're reporting sensor readings that match Dr. Chin's data. The Canadians are activating emergency protocols for British Columbia. Williams, this isn't just about Hawaii anymore. Sarah had been monitoring communications from other Pacific monitoring stations through a secure channel that most people didn't know existed. Her access came from research collaborations that predated the current crisis, academic connections that bypassed official government networks. I'm receiving confirmations from monitoring stations in California, Oregon, Japan, Philippines, and Chile, she said. Everyone who's looking at deep ocean sensor data is seeing the same pattern. The wave system is larger than any historical precedent. Williams finally reached for the red phone. I'm activating immediate full-scale evacuation for all Hawaiian coastal areas. Director, Sarah interrupted. Full-scale evacuation protocols assume people have 45 minutes to reach safety. Based on traffic patterns and population density, most people will need at least 30 minutes just to get out of the impact zones. You need to tell them to abandon everything and run. Run where? Sarah had spent months studying evacuation routes, traffic flow patterns, and geographic safety zones. Her research had included weekend drives through every major population center, timing different routes to high ground, identifying bottlenecks and alternative paths that most people didn't know existed. Honolulu residents need to get above the H1 freeway and keep moving inland. Hilo residents need to cross the Wailuku River and reach elevations above 200 feet. Kailua residents have the longest distance to travel. They need to abandon cars and climb the Koolau Mountains on foot if necessary. Carson was taking notes as fast as Sarah spoke. What about the elderly and disabled populations? Emergency services need to prioritize assisted living facilities, hospitals, and senior centers. But honestly, 15 minutes isn't enough time for organized assisted evacuation. Family members and neighbors are going to have to help each other. Williams spoke into the red phone with a voice that carried 23 years of authority, but none of his usual calm confidence. This is Director Williams at Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. I'm authorizing immediate emergency alert activation for all Hawaiian Islands. Maximum threat level. This is not a drill. The response was immediate and systematic. Emergency alert. System transmitters across the islands began broadcasting a tone that most people had only heard during monthly tests. Cell phones buzzed with messages that overrode all other notifications. Television and radio programming was interrupted by automated announcements that used language like immediate life-threatening situation and seek higher ground immediately. But the system was designed for emergencies that provided at least 30 minutes of warning time. Sarah's phone rang with a call from her sister in Kailua. Sarah, what the hell is happening? The emergency alert says to evacuate immediately, but the traffic isn't moving. Everyone's trying to leave at the same time. Lisa, where are you right now? Stuck on Kalaheo Avenue about half a mile from the bay. Beach. Traffic hasn't moved in 5 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Kalaheo Avenue was in the red zone on her impact projection. At current traffic speeds, Lisa wouldn't reach safety in time. Lisa, you need to abandon your car and climb the ridge on foot. What? Sarah, that's crazy. I can't just leave my car in the middle of the road. Your car is going to be underwater in 30 minutes whether you're in it or not. Get out now and start climbing. Sarah, you're scaring me. Good, you should be scared. Lisa, I need you to trust me. Get out of your car right now and start running uphill. Don't look back. Don't wait for traffic to move. Run. The call ended as Lisa hung up, hopefully to follow her sister's advice rather than dismiss it as panic. Sarah realized that her scientific warnings were colliding with human psychology in ways that her mathematical models hadn't accounted for. People didn't abandon cars easily. They didn't leave possessions behind without compelling reasons. They didn't run from invisible threats, even when those threats were approaching at 400 miles per hour. Across the islands, the emergency alert system was creating its own crisis. Highways became parking lots as hundreds of thousands of people tried to evacuate simultaneously. Emergency services were overwhelmed with calls from people asking for clarification, directions, and reassurance. Radio stations struggled to provide useful information because their standard emergency scripts assumed longer warning times. Director Williams coordinated with local emergency management teams who were reporting that evacuation was proceeding too slowly. The Honolulu Police Department estimated that it would take at least 45 minutes to clear the coastal areas at current traffic speeds. How much time do we actually have? Williams asked Sarah. She looked at her latest sensor readings. 12 minutes until Hilo impact. Traffic there has completely stopped. People are abandoning cars and running, but most of them started too late. Carson was on the phone with FEMA headquarters, explaining a situation that didn't fit any established emergency management category. Sir, this isn't a standard tsunami. The wave heights are unprecedented. Normal evacuation procedures aren't adequate. Yes, sir, I understand the economic implications, but we're looking at potential casualties in the thousands if people don't reach safety in the next 10 minutes. Sarah's screens showed data streams from monitoring stations across the Pacific, all confirming that the wave system was behaving exactly as her models had predicted. The scientific validation should have been satisfying, but instead it filled her with growing dread as she watched the timeline compress toward the moment when theory would become reality. Her sensor network provided real-time updates as the wave system approached the Hawaiian Islands. Station Alpha 12, positioned 50 miles northeast of Hilo, registered the wave front passing overhead with measurements that exceeded even her worst-case projections. Wave height at Alpha 12 is reading 140 feet, she announced to the room. Impact velocity is 420 miles per hour. The wave is carrying more energy than my original calculations suggested. Williams looked at the evacuation status reports coming in from emergency coordinators across the islands. Hilo, 60% evacuated. Honolulu, 45% evacuated. Kailua, 30% evacuated. Rural coastal communities, largely unaware of. The revised timeline. How much worse is this going to be than people expect? Sarah's voice was steady, but everyone in the room could hear the weight of what she was about to say. Director, the standard tsunami evacuation guidelines assume wave heights of 15 to 30 feet, penetrating maybe half a mile inland. This wave is going to be 5 times higher and penetrate 4 times farther. Areas that were never included in evacuation. Zones are going to be destroyed. What about the people who didn't get the message? Rural areas with limited cell coverage. Elderly residents who don't use emergency alert systems. Tourists who aren't familiar with evacuation procedures. People who thought they had 6 hours and decided to wait until morning. Sarah paused. Director, there are going to be people who never knew this was coming. Carson ended his call with FEMA and turned to address the room. Washington wants to know if this event could affect the mainland United States. Sarah pulled up her Pacific-wide projection model. The wave system will reach California in approximately 6 hours, but the energy will be significantly dispersed by then. Mainland impact should be manageable with standard evacuation procedures. Should it be? This is the first cascade failure event of this magnitude in recorded history. We're in uncharted territory. Through the window, the lights of Honolulu continued to twinkle peacefully, unaware that a wall of water taller than most buildings was approaching at speeds that made escape impossible for anyone who hadn't already left. The emergency alert system continued broadcasting instructions that most people couldn't follow in the time available. Sarah looked at the countdown timer she had started when the crisis began. 8 minutes until impact. The wave was now close. Enough that her coastal sensors were beginning to detect the pressure changes that preceded its arrival. It's too late, she said quietly. What? Williams asked. For anyone still in the evacuation zones, it's too late. The wave is going to hit before they can reach safety. Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment and understood exactly what was about to happen. In 8 minutes, we're going to find out how many people believed the warnings and how many thought they had more time. The room fell silent as everyone realized that the crisis phase was over. The disaster phase was about to begin. At 12:17 m. Hilo Bay experienced what seismologists would later classify as the most powerful tsunami impact in Hawaiian recorded history. Sarah watched the event unfold through real-time sensor data, emergency communications, and live news feeds that captured the first moments of devastation. Her sensor station, positioned 3 miles offshore, registered the wave front as it approached the coastline. The readings were precise, mathematical, and terrifying. Wave height 147 feet, forward velocity 398 miles per hour, water displacement volume exceeding 2.3 billion cubic meters. Impact confirmed at Hilo Bay, Sarah announced to the emergency center. Her voice remained professionally calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she typed notes into her incident log. Wave height exceeded projections by 7%. The first emergency communication came from a Hilo police officer who had reached high ground minutes before the wave struck. His radio transmission was brief and shaken. "Base, this is Unit 23. The wave just hit downtown Hilo. Everything below Kamehameha Avenue is gone. I mean everything. It looks like someone erased the city." Director Williams coordinated with emergency response teams who were attempting to assess damage and locate survivors, but their efforts were hampered by the destruction of communication. Infrastructure, transportation networks, and emergency facilities that had been located too close to the waterline. "We're getting scattered reports from Hilo," Williams said, reading updates from multiple emergency channels. "The harbor is completely destroyed. Lyman Field Airport is underwater. Walmart, Safeway, and most of the downtown area were obliterated." Sarah's sister Lisa called at 12:19 a.m. from a ridge overlooking Kailua Bay. "Sarah, I made it to high ground, but I can see cars still on the highway down there. The wave is coming and people are still trying to drive out." "Lisa, how many cars?" "Maybe 50 or 60 vehicles. They're not moving. Traffic is completely stopped." Lisa's voice broke. "Sarah, those people don't know what's coming." Sarah looked at her projected timeline for Oahu impact. "Lisa, the wave will reach Kailua in 4 minutes. Anyone still at sea level won't survive." "Can't we warn them somehow?" "The emergency alert system is already broadcasting continuous warnings. People who are still in cars either can't receive the signals or they're choosing not to abandon their vehicles." Through live helicopter footage, broadcast on local news stations, Sarah watched the wave system approach Oahu's eastern coastline. The aerial perspective showed a dark line on the horizon that grew larger and more defined as it moved toward land at speeds that made escape impossible for anyone who hadn't already reached safety. The wave struck Kailua at 12:22 a.m. with a force that exceeded even Sarah's revised calculations. Live news cameras positioned on high ground captured the moment when a wall of water taller than most buildings swept across the coastal plain, obliterating everything in its path. Cars, houses, trees, and shopping centers disappeared beneath the surge. The highway that had been clogged with evacuating vehicles vanished completely. The wave penetrated nearly 3 miles inland before finally beginning to slow as it encountered the foothills of the Koolau Mountains. "Kailua impact confirmed," Sarah reported. "Penetration distance 2.8 miles inland. Wave height at impact point measured 134 feet. Emergency communications from Oahu became sporadic as transmission towers, emergency facilities, and communication networks were destroyed or damaged. What reports did reach the emergency center painted a picture of devastation that surpassed anything in Hawaiian emergency management experience. Coast Guard helicopter pilot radioed from above Honolulu Harbor. "Center, this is Coast Guard Rescue. 1. Honolulu Harbor no longer exists. The entire waterfront district is underwater. I'm seeing a debris field extending inland to the H1 freeway. Multiple structures collapsed. No visible survivors in the immediate impact zone." Sarah's phone rang with a call from Dr. Yamamoto at the Japan Meteorological Agency. "Dr. Chun, we're monitoring your real-time data feeds. The impact measurements match your projections almost exactly. How did you achieve such accurate calculations?" "Cascade failure theory accounts for variables that standard models ignore," Sarah replied while continuing to track the wave's progress across the Hawaiian Islands. "Dr. Yamamoto, are you seeing evidence of continued fault activity?" "Yes. Our deep ocean sensors indicate the fault system is still unstable. Additional collapse events are possible over the next several hours." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Additional events? How large?" "Potentially 20 to 30% of tonight's magnitude. Dr. Chun, if your models are correct, the Hawaiian Islands could experience secondary tsunami impacts while emergency services are still responding to the primary event." She immediately began calculating the implications of secondary wave impacts on areas already devastated by the initial tsunami. Emergency shelters, rescue operations, and recovery efforts would all be vulnerable to additional waves if the fault system continued to collapse. Dr. Yamamoto, I need to warn our emergency coordinators about the possibility of secondary impacts. We're issuing similar warnings across the Pacific Basin. Dr. Chun, your cascade failure research may have identified a previously unknown tsunami threat pattern. As Sarah ended the call, Director Williams approached her workstation with an expression that combined exhaustion, stress, and grudging respect. Dr. Chun, we're getting damage reports from across the islands. Your projections were accurate within a few percentage points. I wish I had been wrong. So do I, but because you were right, and because you acted when you did, we estimate that 60 to 70% of the coastal population reached safety in time. Sarah pulled up her population analysis spreadsheet. That means 30 to 40% didn't. It means hundreds of thousands of people are alive because you refused to follow protocol. The weight of those numbers hit Sarah in a way that months of theoretical research hadn't prepared her for. Her mathematical models had predicted casualties. But seeing the reality of rescue operations, destroyed communities, and missing persons reports made the human cost impossible to ignore. Emergency response teams across the islands were beginning to report preliminary casualty figures. Hilo, approximately 200 people unaccounted for. Kailua, 150 missing. Honolulu Waterfront District, number still unknown. Rural coastal areas, assessment ongoing. The total could have been over 10,000, Williams said quietly. If people had trusted the original 6-hour evacuation timeline, most of the coastal population would have been caught in their homes or cars. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin Tanaka, the news anchor who had put her on live television. Dr. Chun, Channel 9 is getting calls from people who heard your warning and evacuated immediately. They want to thank you for saving their lives. She didn't respond to the message. The idea of gratitude felt inappropriate when so many people hadn't received the warning in time, or hadn't believed it when they did. Deputy Director Carson coordinated with FEMA headquarters, the National Guard, and Coast Guard rescue operations. We're mobilizing every available search and rescue asset. The Navy is deploying ships from Pearl Harbor. The Air Force is providing helicopter support. But honestly, the scale of this disaster exceeds our immediate response capabilities. Sarah's sensors continued monitoring ocean conditions for signs of additional fault activity. I'm detecting continued seismic activity along the rupture zone. The fault system hasn't stabilized yet. What does that mean for recovery operations? It means rescue teams need to be prepared for secondary tsunami impacts. If additional sections of the fault collapse, we could see waves 20 to 40 feet high reaching areas where emergency services are currently operating. Williams looked at the deployment maps showing rescue operations across the affected areas. How much warning would we have if a secondary event occurs? Maybe 20 minutes. Secondary waves propagate faster because they're traveling through water that's already been displaced by the primary event. Carson made immediate contact with field commanders to warn rescue operations about the possibility of additional tsunami impacts. The warning forced difficult decisions about whether to continue search and rescue efforts in areas that might be struck again, or to withdraw to safer positions while potential survivors remained trapped. At 12:31 a.m., Sarah's deep ocean sensors detected a new pattern of seismic activity. I'm seeing renewed fault movement. Magnitude and location suggest a potential secondary collapse event. How large? Williams asked. Preliminary calculations suggest a wave height of 25 to 35 feet. Arrival time approximately 18 minutes from now. Williams immediately activated secondary Evacuation procedures for rescue operations and emergency personnel working in vulnerable areas. The decision effectively suspended search and rescue efforts just as they were beginning, but it potentially saved the lives of emergency responders who would have been caught in low-lying areas. When the secondary wave arrived, Sarah's prediction proved accurate. The secondary tsunami struck the Hawaiian Islands at 12:49 a.m. with wave heights reaching 31 feet in some areas. While significantly smaller than the primary event, it was large enough to flood areas where rescue operations had been planned, destroy temporary shelters that had been established for evacuees, and complicate recovery efforts for days. The emergency center received confirmation that all rescue personnel had reached safety before the secondary impact, but the additional wave effectively ended any possibility of immediate search and rescue operations in the most severely affected areas. Dr. Chen Williams said as the reports came in confirming the secondary impact, "Your warning about additional waves probably saved the lives of every rescue worker in the field tonight." Sarah stared at her monitors, which now showed ocean conditions beginning to stabilize as the fault system finally reached equilibrium. Her cascade failure models had predicted both the primary and secondary events with remarkable accuracy, but the validation felt hollow against the backdrop of communities that no longer existed. "How many people did we save?" she asked. Carson had been coordinating with population centers across the islands. "Conservative estimate, 800,000 people evacuated. Coastal areas before the primary impact. Without your early warning, maybe 200,000 would have reached safety using standard evacuation procedures. That's 600,000 people. 600,000 people who are alive because you refused to wait for authorization." Sarah's phone rang with calls from research institutions, news organizations, and government agencies who wanted to understand how she had achieved such accurate predictions of an unprecedented natural disaster. But she ignored the calls and focused on her monitoring equipment, watching for any additional signs of geological instability. Outside, emergency responders continued their work under floodlights and helicopter spotlights, searching for survivors. In areas that had been completely transformed by the power of water moving at impossible speeds, the Hawaiian Islands would spend months recovering from the most powerful natural disaster in their recorded history. Sarah's unauthorized decision to bypass emergency protocols had saved more lives than any single action in Hawaiian emergency management history. Her willingness to act without permission had prevented a natural disaster from becoming a human catastrophe. But as she watched the rescue operations and damage assessments continue through the night, she couldn't escape the knowledge that her models had also been precisely accurate about the people who hadn't been saved. The first official acknowledgement came at 3:17 a.m. from Admiral Rebecca Morrison, commander of the Pacific Fleet, in a secure communication to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Sarah learned about it 20 minutes later when Deputy Director Carson received a call from Washington. "Admiral Morrison wants to speak with Dr. Chun directly," Carson announced to the emergency center. She said the Navy's damage assessment confirms that standard evacuation procedures would have resulted in casualties exceeding 8,000 people. Sarah looked up from her monitoring equipment, where she had been tracking aftershock patterns and residual wave activity. "The Admiral wants to speak with me. She wants to understand how civilian research produced more accurate threat assessments than the entire federal monitoring network." The call came through on a secure line that Carson had to authorize. Admiral Morrison's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives, but also a tone of professional curiosity that Sarah hadn't expected. "Dr. Chun, I'm looking at damage reports from Pearl Harbor, Hickam Air Force Base, and coastal Navy facilities. Your wave height projections were accurate within 3%. Your timing predictions were precise to within 90 seconds. How did you achieve that level of accuracy using unauthorized equipment? Sarah had anticipated this question from various officials throughout the night, but she hadn't expected it from someone at Admiral Morrison's level. Admiral, cascade failure theory predicts that complex geological events produce compound effects that aren't captured by standard monitoring models. Dr. Chun, I'm not asking for a theory, I'm asking for methodology. The Joint Chiefs want to know how a university researcher with $47,000 in unauthorized equipment outperformed a $200 million federal monitoring system. The directness of the question forced Sarah to explain the fundamental difference between her approach and official protocols. Admiral, federal monitoring systems are designed to detect tsunamis after they form. My system is designed to predict tsunamis while they're forming. The difference is positioning sensors at geological stress points rather than wave measurement points. And the federal system doesn't do that because ... Because positioning sensors at stress points requires accepting theoretical models that haven't been validated through formal certification processes. Federal agencies can't deploy equipment based on unproven theories. Admiral Morrison paused, and Sarah could hear background conversations that suggested she was in a command center with multiple advisors. Dr. Chun, are you telling me that federal emergency management protocols prevent the deployment of potentially life-saving technology because it hasn't completed bureaucratic review processes? I'm telling you that innovation and certification are different timelines. My sensors use proven technology positioned according to theoretical models that work in practice but haven't been formally validated. And how long would formal validation take? 3 to 5 years, assuming the theory gains acceptance in the academic community and receives funding for large-scale testing. Admiral Morrison's voice carried a note of frustration that Sarah recognized from her own experience with institutional inertia. Dr. Chun, in your professional opinion, how many similar gaps exist between theoretical capabilities and operational implementation? Sarah had spent years observing the difference between what emergency management could do and what it actually did. Admiral, there are research teams across the Pacific studying earthquake prediction, volcanic eruption patterns, severe weather formation, and climate-related disaster scenarios. Most of their work never reaches operational status because implementation requires institutional changes that agencies aren't equipped to make quickly. What would it take to close those gaps? Authorization to deploy experimental monitoring systems based on promising research rather than proven research. Most natural disaster prediction involves scenarios that we hope never occur, which makes proof of concept validation nearly impossible until the disasters actually happen. The conversation continued for 12 minutes, during which Admiral Morrison asked detailed questions about sensor positioning, data processing, international cooperation protocols, and the timeline for expanding cascade failure monitoring to other geological risk areas across the Pacific. When the call ended, Carson looked at Sarah with an expression that had shifted significantly since their first meeting hours earlier. Dr. Chen, I think you just outlined the future of Pacific disaster monitoring to the commander of the Pacific Fleet. I outlined problems that have existed for years. Whether anyone has the authority to solve them is a different question. At 4:23 a.m., Sarah received a call from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Director of the National Science Foundation's Geosciences Division. Dr. Chun, I'm calling from an emergency meeting with representatives from NOAA, FEMA, the Navy, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Sarah had never spoken with anyone from the White House, even indirectly. Dr. Rodriguez, what kind of meeting? The kind where we discuss how to prevent tonight's events from recurring anywhere else in the Pacific Basin. Dr. Chun, your cascade failure research has been elevated to national security priority status. What does that mean? It means you're Theoretical work is being fast-tracked for operational implementation. We're authorizing immediate deployment of cascade monitoring sensor networks at geological risk sites from Alaska to Chile. Sarah felt a mixture of validation and overwhelming responsibility. Dr. Rodriguez, cascade failure monitoring requires positioning sensors in international waters, coordination with foreign monitoring agencies, and real-time data sharing protocols that don't currently exist. Which is why we're establishing an International Pacific Tsunami Research Consortium with you as the founding scientific director. Funding authorization is $340 million over 3 years. The number was so large that Sarah had to ask Dr. Rodriguez to repeat it. In the span of 6 hours, her unauthorized research project had evolved from a potential career-ending protocol violation into a federally funded international collaboration with a budget that exceeded the GDP of some small countries. Dr. Rodriguez, I'm not sure I'm qualified to direct an international consortium. Dr. Chun, you're the only person who predicted tonight's disaster with sufficient accuracy to save hundreds of thousands of lives. As far as we're concerned, you're the most qualified person in the world. While Sarah processed the implications of sudden institutional recognition, similar conversations were occurring throughout the emergency management community. Director Williams received a call from his supervisor at the National Weather Service, who had spent the early morning hours explaining to federal administrators why his regional office had initially rejected the warnings that proved to be accurate. Williams, I need you to document every decision point in last night's response. The Senate Subcommittee on Emergency Management wants a complete timeline of why we nearly ignored the most accurate disaster prediction in agency history. Williams looked across the emergency center toward Sarah, who was still monitoring her sensor network for signs of continued geological instability. Sir, Dr. Chun acted outside established protocols because established protocols weren't designed to handle the type of event she predicted, which raises questions about whether our protocols need fundamental revision. Sir, our protocols exist for good reasons. False alarms cause panic, economic disruption, and loss of public trust. And accurate warnings that we almost ignored cause Senate investigations. Williams, I need you to work with Dr. Chun to develop new protocols that can incorporate non-standard data sources without compromising system reliability. The institutional response was swift and comprehensive. By 6 a.m., Sarah had received calls from research institutions, government agencies, and international organizations across the Pacific Basin. The Japan Meteorological Agency wanted to collaborate on Pacific-wide monitoring. The Australian Bureau of Meteorology requested access to her cascade failure models. The California Emergency Management Agency asked her to assess earthquake-related tsunami risks along the West Coast. Kevin Tanaka called from Channel 9 with a request that surprised Sarah more than all the official recognition. Dr. Chun, we're getting calls from people who want to thank you personally. Families who evacuated because of your television warning. Emergency responders who reached safety because of your secondary wave prediction. Tourists who left beach hotels because they heard your projections. Sarah didn't know how to respond to gratitude on that scale. Kevin, I was doing my job. Dr. Chun, your job description probably doesn't include saving 600,000 people by violating federal protocols. It does now. At 7:15 a.m., Sarah's sister Lisa arrived at the emergency center with a thermos of coffee and an expression of exhausted relief. Sarah, I've been listening to the radio all night. They're calling you a hero. Sarah looked at her monitoring equipment, which continued displaying data from areas where search and rescue operations were still looking for people who hadn't received her warning in time. Heroes don't have casualty counts. Heroes have casualty counts that would have been 10 times higher without them. Lisa sat down beside her sister's workstation and looked at the complex array of screens, charts, and data streams that had produced the most accurate natural disaster prediction in Hawaiian history. Sarah, I don't understand any of this technical stuff, but I understand that I'm alive because you knew things that other people didn't know. I'm alive because you listened when I told you to abandon your car and run uphill. How many people didn't listen? Sarah pulled up her final casualty estimates, which had been updated throughout the night as rescue operations provided more complete information. Current estimates suggest approximately 800 people didn't evacuate in time. Most of them were in areas that weren't included in standard evacuation zones. How many people would have died if you hadn't warned anyone? Sarah displayed her population analysis model, which calculated casualty projections based on different evacuation scenarios. Conservative estimate, 8,000 to 12,000 people. Realistic estimate, 15,000 to 20,000. Worst case scenario, over 25,000. Lisa stared at the numbers in silence for several minutes. Sarah, you saved more people last night than most people save in their entire lives. I saved people who were willing to believe warnings that contradicted official information. A lot of people weren't willing to do that. Deputy Director Carson approached with a folder containing documentation that he had been preparing since the disaster began. Dr. Chun, I need you to review this incident report before it goes to Washington. Sarah opened the folder and found a minute-by-minute timeline of the night's events, including her unauthorized broadcasts, her data transmission to international agencies, and the decision-making process that led to the eventual emergency alert activation. Carson, this document makes it look like I acted appropriately. Dr. Chun, you did act appropriately. You identified a threat that official systems missed. You warned the public when official channels failed to respond quickly enough, and you provided accurate information that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. I also violated federal emergency protocols, bypassed chain of command authority, and distributed unverified data to international agencies. Carson looked at her steadily. Which protocol should we recommend that future emergency responders follow when they encounter similar situations? The question forced Sarah to confront the fundamental tension between institutional procedures and individual judgment that had defined the entire night. Emergency management systems existed to prevent rogue actions by individuals who might be wrong, but those same systems had nearly prevented the action that proved to be right. I don't know, she said honestly. Dr. Chun, that's why they're asking you to help write new protocols that can handle scenarios like last night. At 8:30 a.m., Director Williams called for a formal debrief session with all emergency center personnel who had participated in the night's response. Sarah found herself at the center of a discussion that reviewed every decision point, analyzed alternative outcomes, and attempted to identify lessons that could be applied to future emergencies. The primary finding, Williams concluded, is that Dr. Chun's unauthorized actions probably prevented the largest natural disaster casualty event in Hawaiian history. The secondary finding is that our protocols need revision to incorporate non-standard data sources and rapid response capabilities. One of the emergency coordinators who had initially opposed Sarah's warnings raised a concern that nobody wanted to address directly. Director, if we revise protocols to allow individual researchers to bypass authority chains, how do we prevent false alarms from people who aren't as qualified as Dr. Chun? The question highlighted the fundamental challenge of institutional reform: how to enable rapid response to accurate warnings without enabling panic responses to inaccurate warnings. Sarah provided an answer that surprised everyone, including herself. You don't prevent false alarms. You create systems that can evaluate and respond to warnings quickly enough that false alarms don't cause more damage than missed true alarms. Meaning you accept that some warnings will be wrong, and you design response protocols that can be scaled up or down based on real-time verification rather than advanced certification. Williams realized that Sarah was describing a fundamental shift from prevention-based emergency management to adaptation-based emergency management. Instead of trying to prevent all false alarms, the system would focus on minimizing the consequences of both false alarms and missed true alarms. Dr. Chen, what you're suggesting would require rebuilding emergency management systems from the ground up. Director, what happened last night suggests that rebuilding might be necessary. As the debrief session concluded, Sarah returned to her monitoring equipment and the work that had occupied her attention for the past 18 hours. Her sensors continued collecting data from across the Pacific, watching for signs of geological instability that might trigger the next cascade failure event. The recognition was gratifying, but the responsibility was overwhelming. She was no longer an unauthorized researcher working with experimental equipment. She was the founding director of an international monitoring consortium with the authority and obligation to prevent similar disasters across the entire Pacific Basin. Her phone buzzed with another call from a research institution wanting to discuss collaboration. But she ignored it and focused on the data streams that continued flowing from sensors positioned at stress points that most people still didn't understand. The wave was over, but the work was just beginning, 6 months after the night that redefined Pacific tsunami monitoring. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in a conference room overlooking Pearl Harbor, addressing representatives from 17 nations who had gathered to establish the International Pacific Cascade Monitoring Network. The woman who had once worked alone in an unauthorized lab now commanded resources that spanned 4 time zones and included the most sophisticated geological monitoring system in human history. But the recognition had come with costs that she hadn't anticipated. Dr. Chen asked Dr. Heinrich Müller from the German Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources, "Your cascade failure theory has been validated by 3 independent research teams, but implementation across the Pacific Basin will require unprecedented international cooperation. How do we ensure that political disagreements don't compromise scientific warning systems?" Sarah looked around the conference table at faces representing countries that had historical tensions, territorial disputes, and competing economic interests. Creating a truly international monitoring network meant convincing nations to share sensitive geological data and coordinate emergency responses despite political differences. Dr. Müller, natural disasters don't respect political boundaries. A cascade failure event in one region affects everyone within 2,000 miles. Either we coordinate monitoring and response protocols, or we accept that political considerations will occasionally override scientific warnings. The Chinese representative, Dr. Li Wei from the China Earthquake Administration, raised a concern that had complicated negotiations for months. Dr. Chen, real-time geological monitoring provides information that could be used for military purposes. How do we balance scientific transparency with national security? It was a question that Sarah had wrestled with since accepting her new position. Deep ocean sensor networks could detect submarine movements, underwater weapons testing, and seismic characteristics of underground facilities. Creating an effective tsunami warning system required sharing data that governments normally classified. Dr. Li, we establish monitoring protocols that provide sufficient information for tsunami prediction without revealing data that compromises national security. The sensor network can be designed to detect geological instability without mapping detailed underwater topography. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering technical specifications, funding responsibilities, legal frameworks, and response protocols. Sarah found herself mediating between scientific requirements and political realities in ways that her academic training hadn't prepared her for. When the meeting concluded, she walked alone to the memorial overlooking Pearl Harbor, where she often came to think about the relationship between individual decisions and historical consequences. The memorial commemorated events triggered by decisions made by people, who couldn't have fully understood the implications of their actions. Her phone buzzed with a text message from James Rodriguez, who now served as Deputy Director of the Pacific Tsunami Research Center. Sarah, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, is reporting unusual seismic activity near New Zealand. The pattern looks similar to early-stage Cascade development. Sarah immediately accessed the monitoring network through her secure phone app and reviewed the Australian data. The readings showed minor fault displacement in an area that wasn't typically associated with large-scale seismic events. Under the old monitoring protocols, the activity would have been classified as routine tectonic adjustment. Under her Cascade failure models, it represented a potential early warning of geological instability that could develop into something more significant. She called James directly. What's the timeline on the New Zealand activity? If it follows Cascade progression patterns, we could see major displacement events within 72 hours. But the readings are still within normal variance ranges. We could be looking at routine tectonic activity that will stabilize naturally. Sarah faced the same type of decision that had defined the night 6 months earlier. Act on preliminary data that suggested potential danger, or wait for more definitive information that might arrive too late to be useful. James, what's the population density in the affected area? The Auckland region has 1.7 million people. Wellington has 400,000. If we're wrong about Cascade development, we'd be triggering unnecessary evacuation preparations for over 2 million people. And if we're right but wait for confirmation, we could be looking at another Hawaii situation, except with less warning time because Cascade development appears to be accelerating in this location. Sarah made a decision that reflected how much her perspective had changed since the night she first bypassed official protocols. James, alert the New Zealand GeoNet Agency and recommend enhanced monitoring. Share our Cascade detection algorithms. And offer technical support for accelerated data analysis. Should we issue preliminary warnings to emergency management agencies? Not yet. But we put them on notification that we're tracking potential instability. If the pattern develops further, we'll have response systems ready to activate immediately. The approach represented a middle path between her old unauthorized warnings and traditional bureaucratic delays. Instead of bypassing official channels, she now worked to accelerate official channels while they could still respond effectively. 3 hours later, Dr. James Harrison from New Zealand's GeoNet called with an update. Dr. Chun, we've implemented your enhanced monitoring protocols and we're seeing the Cascade pattern development you predicted. The fault system appears to be approaching critical instability. Timeline? Potentially 18 to 24 hours until major displacement. We're activating precautionary evacuation protocols for coastal areas. Sarah's early warning system had prevented another tsunami disaster, but this time through coordination rather than confrontation. The institutional changes that followed the Hawaiian tsunami had created systems that could respond to her warnings quickly enough to save lives without triggering unnecessary panic. Her phone rang with a call from Admiral Morrison, who now served as military liaison to the International Pacific Monitoring Network. Dr. Chen, we're receiving reports that your New Zealand prediction prevented a potential disaster involving approximately 300,000 people in vulnerable coastal areas. Admiral, the prediction was a team effort involving monitoring stations across the Pacific. This wasn't about individual judgment overriding institutional procedures. Dr. Chen, it was about institutional procedures that had been redesigned to incorporate individual judgment. That's the difference between what happened 6 months ago and what happened yesterday. The distinction was important because it highlighted how emergency management systems had evolved since the Hawaiian tsunami. Instead of choosing between individual initiative and institutional reliability, the new protocols created frameworks that enabled rapid individual initiative within institutional reliability. Sarah's unauthorized sensor network had become the foundation for the Pacific Cascade Monitoring System, with over 200 deep ocean sensors positioned at geological stress points from Alaska to Chile. Her theoretical research had been expanded into operational procedures used by emergency management agencies across 3 continents. But perhaps more significantly, her willingness to act without permission had inspired changes in how emergency management systems balanced innovation with reliability. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the former news assignment editor who had put Sarah on live television, called with a request that surprised her. "Dr. Chun, I'm working on a documentary about emergency decision-making, and I want to explore what motivates people to act when institutions fail to respond adequately. Patricia, I'm not sure my experience represents a broader pattern." Dr. Chun, since the Hawaiian tsunami, we've documented dozens of cases where individuals with specialized knowledge took unauthorized actions that prevented disasters or saved lives. Emergency responders who violated protocols to rescue people from dangerous situations. Scientists who shared warnings through unofficial channels when official channels were too slow. Medical professionals who implemented unproven treatments when conventional treatments weren't available. Sarah realized that Patricia was describing a phenomenon that extended far beyond tsunami prediction. What do these cases have in common? People who understood the consequences of inaction better than they feared the consequences of unauthorized action. People who were willing to be wrong in order to avoid being sorry. The conversation made Sarah think about the broader implications of individual initiative within institutional frameworks. Emergency management, scientific research, medical treatment, and many other fields required balancing established procedures with adaptive responses to unprecedented situations. Patricia, what conclusions are you drawing from this research? That institutions need to create more space for individual judgment without sacrificing systematic reliability. That expertise shouldn't be constrained by authorization when lives are at stake. That sometimes following orders means ignoring orders. 6 months after the Hawaiian tsunami, Sarah had received dozens of awards, commendations, and honorary degrees recognizing her scientific contributions and life-saving actions. But the recognition that meant most to her came from sources that had nothing to do with professional achievement. A handwritten letter from Maria Santos, a kindergarten teacher in Hilo. "Dr. Chun, my students are alive because you warned their families to evacuate immediately. Thank you for caring more about our safety than about following rules." An email from Captain Robert Kim, a Coast Guard rescue swimmer. "Dr. Chun, your secondary wave warning allowed our teams to reach safety before the second tsunami hit. 6 rescue swimmers are alive because you predicted something that nobody else saw coming." A phone call from Jennifer Morrison, a hotel manager in Kailua. "Dr. Chun, we evacuated 200 guests based on your television warning. The hotel was destroyed, but everyone survived. How do you thank someone for saving 200 lives?" Sarah had learned that recognition comes in many forms, but the most meaningful recognition comes from people whose lives are changed by actions taken when those actions matter most. The International Pacific Cascade Monitoring Network now operates 24 hours a day, coordinating tsunami warnings across 17 nations and protecting coastal populations from Alaska to Chile. The system represents the largest international scientific collaboration in disaster prevention history, and it exists because one person refused to wait for permission to act on information that could save lives. But Sarah's story isn't unique. Around the world, every day, people make decisions to act without authorization when they possess knowledge that others need and institutional systems aren't equipped to respond quickly enough. Emergency medical technicians who implement treatments that aren't specifically authorized for their certification level. Teachers who report suspected abuse despite procedural complications. Engineers who halt construction projects when they observe safety issues that haven't been officially documented. Pilots who deviate from flight plans to avoid weather conditions that control systems haven't yet recognized. The common thread isn't expertise, authority, or institutional position. It's the willingness to accept personal responsibility for consequences that extend beyond personal interests. Sarah Chun's sensor network saved hundreds of thousands of lives because she understood that being right mattered more than being authorized. Her decision to bypass official protocols wasn't about defying authority. It was about accepting responsibility when authority systems weren't designed to handle the information she possessed. In a world where institutional procedures exist for good reasons, but can't anticipate every situation that requires rapid response, individual judgment becomes the bridge between systematic reliability and adaptive effectiveness. The Hawaiian tsunami taught emergency management agencies that expertise sometimes exists outside official channels, that innovation often precedes authorization, and that preventing disasters occasionally requires breaking rules designed to prevent false alarms. But more broadly, it demonstrated that institutional strength comes not from preventing individual initiative, but from creating frameworks that can incorporate individual initiative when it's accurate and override it when it's not. Sarah Chun was willing to risk her career to save lives because she understood that some risks are worth taking and some consequences are too important to avoid through procedural compliance. Her story matters not because she was extraordinary, but because she was ordinary. She was a scientist with specialized knowledge who chose to act on that knowledge when acting mattered more than waiting for permission. Around the world, in hospitals and laboratories, in emergency services and schools, in engineering firms and government agencies, people face similar decisions every day. They possess information that others need, but sharing that information requires stepping outside established procedures, challenging institutional inertia, or accepting personal responsibility for outcomes that affect other people. The lesson of the Hawaiian tsunami isn't that rules should be broken, but that rules should be designed to enable good judgment rather than constrain it. That expertise should be empowered rather than limited by authorization processes. That individual initiative and institutional reliability aren't opposing forces, but complementary elements of effective systems. Sarah Chun's unauthorized sensor network became the foundation of an international monitoring system because she was willing to be judged by results rather than procedures. Her decision to act without permission saved lives because she understood that permission is less important than competence when people's safety depends on rapid response to accurate information. In the end, her story is about the courage to act on knowledge when action matters more than authorization, and the wisdom to accept responsibility for consequences that extend beyond personal interests. It's a story that repeats itself whenever individuals choose to do what they believe is right rather than what they're told is authorized. And it's a reminder that sometimes the most important action anyone can take is the action they take without being asked, without being authorized, and without being certain that anyone will understand why they chose to act rather than wait for someone else to give them permission. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.